When Clint Eastwood walked into his own restaurant one quiet evening, he expected nothing more than a good meal and a familiar atmosphere. The establishment, well known for its rustic charm and high-quality cuisine, had become a favorite for both locals and visitors. Clint had poured his heart into making the place special, not just for the food, but for the people who worked there. Dressed simply, with a low-brimmed hat and a casual jacket, he blended in with the crowd. Most of the patrons had no idea they were dining in a place owned by a Hollywood legend. That's how he liked it. No special treatment, no grand entrances. He preferred to observe, take in the details, and enjoy the moment. As he walked past the entrance, nodding to a couple of staff members who recognized him, something unusual caught his attention. A faint sound, almost drowned out by the clinking of glasses and soft music, came from a corner of the restaurant. It was quiet, but distinct, a muffled sob. Clint's sharp instincts, honed over decades both in Hollywood and real life, kicked in. He turned his head slightly, scanning the restaurant, and spotted a young waitress standing near the kitchen entrance. Her back was to him, her shoulders trembling slightly as she wiped her face with a napkin. He paused, watching for a moment. He had encountered many people in distress throughout his life, and he knew better than to barge in without understanding the situation. But something about the way she tried to hide her emotions, the way she quickly adjusted her apron and put on a brave face, struck him. Clint took a deep breath and approached her calmly, his deep voice cutting through the background noise. "Everything. Okay, miss?" The waitress flinched slightly before turning around. Her eyes widened when she realized who was speaking to her. "Mr. Eastwood," she stammered, quickly wiping her face. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." He raised a hand, signaling that there was no need to apologize. "Take your time," he said softly. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" She hesitated, looking down at her hands. The other staff members had noticed the conversation but kept their distance, understanding that Clint's presence carried a certain weight. The waitress took a deep breath. "It's just," she hesitated, her voice shaky. "My mom's sick. She's in the hospital and the bills are piling up. I'm working double shifts, but it's still not enough. Her voice broke, and she looked away, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't be saying all this while I'm on the clock." Clint's expression remained unreadable, but those who knew him well would have recognized the subtle shift, the quiet empathy in his gaze. He had built his career playing tough, resilient characters, but behind that was a man who had seen hardship and understood the weight of real struggles. "Sounds like you're carrying a heavy load," he said after a pause. "And you're doing your best to keep going." She nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir. I just want to take care of her." Clint glanced around the restaurant, then back at her. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she said quietly. "Well, Sarah," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his wallet. He took out a few crisp bills, more than enough to cover a hefty hospital bill, and placed them gently in her hand. "Consider this a little help along the way." Her eyes widened in shock. "Oh no, Mr. Eastwood, I can't." He held up a hand again, cutting off her protest. "Yes, you can, and you will." His voice was firm but kind. "I've been around long enough to know when someone just needs a little break, and from what I can see, you're someone who deserves one." Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they weren't from sadness. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need," he said with a small smile. "Just keep doing what you're doing, and tell your mom she raised one heck of a strong daughter." Sarah nodded, overcome with emotion, and Clint gave her a reassuring nod before turning to walk back toward the dining area. The other employees, who had watched the exchange in quiet admiration, gave him small, knowing smiles. He sat down at his usual booth, ordered his meal as if nothing had happened, and enjoyed the evening in his own quiet way. He didn't seek attention for his kindness, didn't make a grand announcement, because to him the best acts of generosity were the ones done when no one was watching. But that night, everyone who had witnessed what happened knew they had seen something special. It wasn't just about the money. It was about a man who, despite all his fame and success, still took the time to notice when someone was hurting. Sarah stood there for a long moment, clutching the bills in her hand as if afraid they might disappear. The other waitstaff exchanged glances, still absorbing what they had just witnessed. Some of them had worked at the restaurant for years, but none had ever seen Clint Eastwood do something like that firsthand. Word traveled fast. By the time Clint had finished his meal, a quiet buzz had settled over the restaurant. Customers whispered among themselves, waiters stole glances in his direction, and the kitchen staff exchanged knowing nods. But Clint didn't act any different. He ate his meal, occasionally glancing around the room as if nothing had happened. That was just his way. As he prepared to leave, Sarah hesitated before approaching again. She had spent her break calling her mother, telling her what had just happened, and hearing the overwhelming gratitude in her mother's voice had nearly brought her to tears again. But she knew she had to thank him properly. "Mr. Eastwood?" she said softly as he stood near the exit, adjusting his jacket. He turned, those iconic steely eyes settling on her. "Yeah?" Sarah hesitated, then said, "I just wanted to say, you didn't have to do that, but you did, and it means more than you'll ever know." Clint studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference," he said simply. Sarah swallowed hard. "I promise I'll pay it forward one day." A small smile touched the corner of Clint's lips. "That's all I ask." With that, he tipped his hat slightly, turned, and stepped out into the night. As soon as the door shut behind him, the restaurant seemed to exhale. The tension of the moment melted away, replaced by a quiet warmth. One of the older waiters, a man who had been working there for years, let out a soft chuckle. "That's Clint for you," he said. "Always watching, always listening, and when you least expect it, he steps in." Sarah looked down at the money in her hand. It wasn't just cash, it was hope. A chance to breathe, to help her mother, to keep pushing forward. Over the next few weeks, the story of Clint's quiet generosity spread. Customers came in and asked about it, and while Sarah didn't share all the details, those who had been there that night knew the truth. The restaurant took on a new kind of energy, as if people could feel the goodness lingering in the air. One evening, not long after that fateful night, Sarah finished her shift and found an envelope tucked into her locker. Inside was a handwritten note and a small sum of cash. "For your mom, from a friend." She blinked back tears, realizing that Clint's kindness had started something bigger than even he might have expected. And somewhere, out in the vast world beyond that little restaurant, Clint Eastwood carried on as he always had, never seeking attention, never asking for recognition. Just a man who, in the quietest moments, chose to make a difference. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah found herself working with a renewed sense of purpose. The weight on her shoulders didn't feel quite as heavy anymore. It wasn't just about the money Clint had given her, it was about what the gesture had meant. Someone had seen her, really seen her, and believed she was worth helping. That kind of kindness changed a person. One afternoon, as she was setting up tables before the dinner rush, the restaurant manager, a grizzled but kind-hearted man named Jack, pulled her aside. "Got a minute, kid?" he asked, rubbing the back of his neck. Sarah nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sure, what's up?" Jack hesitated, then let out a breath. "Word's been getting around about what Clint did for you. Folks have been asking about it. Some customers have been slipping a little extra cash into their tips, saying it's for Sarah's mom." Sarah's eyes widened. "What?" Jack pulled an envelope from his pocket and pressed it into her hands. It was thicker than usual. "We've been collecting it for you. Figured you might need it." Sarah opened the envelope and felt her breath hitch. Inside was a stack of bills, enough to make a real difference in her mother's medical bills. Her hands trembled as she looked up at Jack. I don't know what to say." Jack shrugged. "A thank you usually works," he said with a grin. But don't thank me. Thank him. That man didn't just help you, kid. He reminded people that doing good matters. Sarah nodded, blinking back tears. She clutched the envelope to her chest and whispered, I will. A few nights later, Clint Eastwood returned to the restaurant just as unassuming as before. No grand entrance, no fanfare, just a man looking for a quiet meal. Sarah spotted him the moment he walked in, and this time she wasn't nervous. She walked straight up to his table, a warm smile on her face. Welcome back, Mr. Eastwood. He looked up at her, nodding. Good to see you, Sarah. She hesitated, then placed a small folded note beside his plate before stepping back. Clint raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. He picked up the note, unfolded it, and read the handwritten words inside. Because of you, I was able to help my mom. And because of you, others helped too. Thank you for reminding me that kindness is still alive. I won't forget, and I promise, I'll keep paying it forward. Clint read the note twice, then glanced back up at Sarah. His expression was unreadable. At first, but then, slowly, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He gave her a single nod of approval, the kind of nod that said more than words ever could. And that was enough. Sarah went back to work, the warmth of that moment. Staying with her, she knew she'd never forget the night Clint Eastwood had walked into her life, not as a movie star, not as a legend, but as a man who saw someone in need and chose to help. And long after he left that night, his presence lingered, not just in the restaurant, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed what a single act of kindness could do.